The Siren was requested for dissection a while back when the series was nowhere near S, but here we are now. However, this is going to be a bit of a chonker as these ladies have quite a history. Right off the bat, I imagine many of you picture the Siren like this. Well, you are not wrong per se, but the original Sirens were birds or just women, and medieval bestiaries and scholars were the ones who slowly transformed their image, practically equating them with mermaids or horsewomen. But I'm getting ahead of myself. In order to properly explore the scope of this mythical creature, we should separate the classical and medieval versions. Even though the latter was inspired by the former, there were a lot of other influences. It is unclear when exactly the sirens were conceived as a concept, but Homer was among the very first to write about them. However, their mention is only a relatively short one, which is rather weird when you think about the cultural importance this story has. I'm quite certain most of you know of Odysseus' brush with the ladies. It all happened after him and his crew spent a bit of time on Circe's isle. The enchantress forewarned him of the danger the sirens pose. Their sweet song lures anyone who hears it, permanently trapping them on their isle via their heavenly voice. As a countermeasure, Odysseus stuffed the ears of his men using beeswax, but not his own. He wished to hear this fabled song and so ordered his sailors to tie him to the mast and not to release him regardless of how much he begged, threatened or bargained. The reason this part is relatively short is because everything goes according to plan. He listens to the beautiful song, the selfish bastard, while his men row past the isle. We are given little information as to who or what the sirens are beside their gender, and the fact that there are two. This led artists to often render them as just regular women who sing on an island covered in flowers and bones. Now, you might notice the slight detail that there are more than two here, but that's because nothing is consistent with the sirens. Homer mentions 2, but 3 and 4 are also prominently stated later on, with many authors even presenting their names. As the culmination of all this, in some later versions, most names are used, raising the number of sirens up to 11 at times, but that is beyond classical literature. Here's a list of all the possible names, which I'm not going to attempt to read out. Beside this information, later mentions also speak of their looks, origins, the location of their isle, or even include them in other stories. Let's begin with the description. Early depictions show the sirens as birds with the head of women and in some cases beards. Later variations also include a female torso and at times arms. The versions with arms occasionally had their wings omitted or attached either to their back or bird part. These creatures were often illustrated with musical instruments like lyres, harps or flutes even. This array of images was vastly extended in the Middle Ages, but we are not at that section. The island where they dwelled was often speculated upon, and we have quite a list of possible habitats. In the Odyssey, the crew supposedly passes by them before they reach Scylla and Charybdis, which are known to have represented the Strait of Messina. However, the directions are quite cryptic, so we cannot really pinpoint the direction beyond the general area. The Roman poets come to our rescue, however, as they have quite a few ideas about it. They dubbed it Sirenum Scopuli, or referred to it by the name Anthemusa. Its location was theorized to be the Tyrrhenian Sea near Cape Pellorum, now known as Faroe Point, among the Cyrenosas close to the city of Paestum, or amidst the cliffs and rocks surrounding Caprae. Pliny the Elder had a much different idea though. He believed sirens lived in India. The habitat itself varies from flowery meadow to jagged stones jutting out of the water, but one thing is constant: the rotting bodies of their victims. While they were often viewed as man-eaters, it seems like they were not originally meant to be. Their victims died of dehydration, starvation or disease, enamored by their song, unable to leave. These bodies simply laid there and decayed into nothing but bones over time. Although Pliny the Elder swung his erect influence over later periods around and decided they tear people apart. Thus, sirens were thought of as carnivores thereafter. So they did not sing to eat. Then, why did they lure unsuspecting sailors to their doom? The answer can occasionally be found in their origin stories which had no similarities between one another. The sirens are often portrayed as daughters of divinity, fathered by either Phorcys, the primordial sea god, Achilles, a god associated with the river by the same name, or were born from the unity of Oceanus, the titan linked to water, and Gaia, the personification of earth. However, they are not always of divine origins, occasionally mentioned as mere mortals. In some instances they are born as half-bird, but there are two stories where they are blessed or cursed with hybridity, or even their duty to lead men astray. I'll quickly recap these two as they are widely different. In the first, the Sirens were playmates of Persephone, daughter of Zeus, and Demeter, the goddess of harvest, agriculture and fertility. Hades, with the approval of Zeus, kidnapped the girl, aiming to make her the queen of the underworld. Demeter did not like this though, and wished to get her daughter back. She sent the Sirens after her, giving them wings to locate her more easily. This first story has another version though, where the Sirens fail to intervene during the abduction of Persephone. In this case, Demeter means the bird form as a curse, condemning them to search for her daughter the world over. The second story involves Aphrodite. She's quite a prick in this one. The Sirens hold their virginity very dear and wouldn't submit to any man or god. For their audacity, the goddess curses them, condemning them to sing their siren song. What a b- Speaking of stories, there are a few sequels to their appearance in the Odyssey. While some believed that the fact Odysseus has heard their song without succumbing led them to drown themselves in the sea, others had different ideas. All, and quite unfortunately for the Sirens. One involves the Muses. Hera convinces them to enter a singing contest, which the inspirational goddesses win. For their reward, they pluck every feather from the Sirens, crafting crowns with the material. As a result, bird women are rendered flightless for the rest of their existence. Man, Greek deities are all assholes. They appear in the Argonautica, meeting Jason and his crew. Chiron the Centaur advised him to bring Orpheus along, who is a skilled musician. Upon hearing the song of the Sirens, instead of succumbing to the allure, he grabs his lyre and begins to sing his own tune. His music is superior to that of the ladies, which makes them turn to stone. As the last part of the classical section, I must also mention the role of Sirens in funerary customs. These figures were often used as part of tombstones, either in the form of engravings or statuettes. There are two different things they could represent. Sirens were regarded as psychopomps, creatures that lead the souls of the dead towards the afterlife. They might also have had a purpose for the living, playing their song to lament the passing of loved ones. Throughout the classical era, these creatures were already represented in a variety of ways, but these times cannot hold a candle to how inconsistent the Middle Ages were. While the Physiologus can be dated back to the 2nd century, I have to mention it in this section as it was the primary source from which later scholars took their references. The Sirens are described here as mortal beings who dwell in the sea with the voice of muses, quite inaccuracy there, and are half women, half geese. Now, in the Middle Ages, the transition of the Sirens to quasi-mermaids began quite early. The culprit was Isidore of Seville, who lived from 560 to 636 and failed to efficiently copy prior sources. He declared that Sirens have fishtails instead of bird lower parts and that their feet are webbed. While this seems like a sudden change, I am going to cut the guy some slack. If you look at the drawings of the time, there was often little difference between scales and feathers, or fins and feathers. Knowing that the Sirens are marine creatures, this is not an unlikely assumption. This is what I think anyway. It's just a theory. No, I'm not going to say the game theory catchphrase. Shame on you for even thinking about it. This was one step towards their transformation into mermaids, and Eldhelm, an Anglo-Saxon scholar, abbot and bishop all rolled into one, continued paving this path. He was the author of the Liber Monstrorum, an encyclopedia of fantastical creatures. In it are a few lines describing the Sirens, presumably based on Isidore's account or other misinformation circulating at the time. He mentions these, and I quote, "Sea girls have fishtails." What he forgot to mention were the bird parts, stating that they lurk in the sea. And thus, the classical and medieval versions split into rather different beasts. Indeed, the Sirens were more so a symbol of vanity in the Middle Ages, often portrayed with combs and mirrors, less so with instruments. In Christianity, they often came to represent lust and prostitution, with courtesans labeled as sirens. The song of these birds and or fish ladies was often equated to the poisoned words of heretics. However, since now two versions of the same creature existed in literature, confusion ran amok, creating more and more variants. At some point, two-tailed sirens became quite prominent, presumably as a way to represent seafaring legs. According to the Catalan-Estonese world map, which was created in the 1460s, there are three types of sirens. All three are half women, but one variant is half fish, another half bird, and the third is half horse. This last image was not too popular though, and there are rather few of such sirens. On the other hand, the hybrid ladies themselves became quite common decorative elements throughout the era, bleeding into the Renaissance. There was this weird idea in the Middle Ages that sea life mirrors the surface world and that everything on dry land has an equivalent in the sea. Many artists used sirens to represent humans under the waves, with male variants being created to add onto the pile. This image is particularly interesting as it shows a siren knight clad in armor, prepared for war or jousting. Disregarding the impracticality of a heavy metal suit worn underwater or the impossible task of forging steel beneath the ocean, it is a neat little concept. I know I said we'd have two sections, but I had to sneak this third one in. The tale of sirens is not over, as there is one, or rather two more events they influenced. In modern times, the image of mermaids and sirens congealed into one amorphous blob, the two words used practically as synonyms. This was also true for the early 1800s. During this period, an animal order and an animal family were named after sirens, referring to their fish version. The Sirenia order is one that encompasses dugongs and manatees, along with a few other extinct families. These animals are believed to have inspired mermaid tales, so it is a bit ironic that they were not named after the proper mythical creature. The family is less known, but all the more interesting. Sirenidae, or simply sirens, are salamanders. They are among the very few animals who possess only four limbs with no hind legs whatsoever. Also, their teeth have mostly devolved, instead using a beak-like structure. They are rather unique little beasts, and I'd encourage you to read up on them, as I'll move on from here for the sake of brevity. I have one last thing to mention before we move on to the creature crafting stage. The voice of the sirens is believed by some to be based upon the song of a real bird. The nightingale is a rather common little animal which is named after its beautiful song. The species is migratory, moving between Europe and Africa, so it is perfectly plausible that it could be heard while sailing in some occasions. However, I personally would not put too much faith into this idea. I wouldn't say their singing is bad, but it definitely does not sound like instruments or the voice of women, let alone both. I doubt many sailors were led to their doom by the little ones. This is all the noteworthy information I could gather, but we're not done here. As per usual, I'll now take a look at this creature and attempt to morph it into an animal that could theoretically exist. First things first, I should decide which depiction I'd use. I'm going to opt out of the fish one, as I feel like that would take away my chance to ever cover mermaids in this format. Bye bye mermaid tying, I guess. I'm also going to ignore the half-horse stuff, because nobody's here for that. 1, 2, 4, oh for fuck's sake. Seems like every second creature I dissect is a hexapod. No, I'm going to ignore this version too. There's one more fortunately. Bird with woman's face. The beard could come in handy too. Alright, let me temper your expectations. This is one of those creatures that is extremely difficult to make both evolutionarily sound and close to the original. One side has to take a backseat here, and it's not going to be the realistic portion, not in my series. What I aim to do here is a bird that roughly has a humanoid face. It's the most I can do with it. The best possible candidates for this are owls. They have a round face, which is quite uncommon among birds, being the ones who most resemble humans in this regard. Not that there's much competition. Some say the harpy eagles are a bit human-like, but I wouldn't degrade them like that. As with owls, we have a better shot at this. However, I would not classify this animal in the making beyond the strigiformis order yet, as we are about to do some pretty significant changes. The human nose. Its magnificent edifice defines the face, while its absence births despicable horrors. It is pretty important, I'd say, but however do not tend to have such appendages. Yet their beak is a beacon of hope in this darkest of hours. For reference purposes, enter the kakapo. Now, despite being called an owl parrot, it has nothing to do with actual owls. However, its beak is a nice proof of concept. It's a bit like a lumpy nose. We could use something similar on our budding Siren, although there might be complications. Sea owls are exclusively predators or insectivores at the very least. How could something adapted to consume fruits, seeds, or plants in general be used for predation? Well, the kakapo's beak has evolved to be particularly useful at stripping away the inedible, often tough shells or fibers surrounding the tasty bits. Now, could there be an animal that lives in salt water, generally close to the shore, which has a hard shell that has to be broken to consume its innards? There are obviously many such things, but owls are usually not interested in them, opting instead to hunt for fish. However, this is well within the realm of possibilities, an owl species adapting to eat shellfish, populating the many isles and coasts of the Reniers Sea, beating out smaller birds with a taste for the stuff. While we are taking the beak of a parrot and applying it to an owl, we won't have to modify it too much. The two are rather similar in design, surprisingly, so making it a bit sharper with less of a downwards curve ought to be enough. So the nose is visible, but not the mouth. That's not a very humanoid face. No, it's not. Moving on. Alright, I'll address this. As is the case with most animals that were ever perceived as monsters throughout history, a resemblance is all it takes to make ridiculous assumptions. We'll attempt to add more facial features, but not all. Next up is the question of hair. Well, feathered crests can occasionally be seen as hair. Trouble is, owls do not tend to have those kinds. Some species have prominent ear tufts, but few would ever mistake those for any kind of hair. Also, if we are going to add any kind of plumage to their head, we should take into account how awkward that would be. These birds have the rare ability to rotate their head in 270 degrees, and having a longer set of feathers twist all around their neck whenever they do so would be quite a detriment. Another semi-bad option would be to take a look at owl chicks. The feathers of younglings, especially when they are going through the process of shedding them for adult ones, can make the appearance of a messy hair. Look at this one for example. It's looking quite seductively too. Not unlike a siren would. Yes, I know I'm talking about an underage animal. So this is one option, but there is a problem. Young owls can be quite small, and sirens are usually depicted as rather large. Also, chicks are far less frequently visible to humans, as their parents hide them from prying eyes. Such a thing would not likely contribute much to the legend, seeing that known owls weren't believed to have hair either, despite going through this phase. There's only one possibility left, or rather a combination of two. We can spice up the head plumage of these sirens to resemble short hair, maybe hair tied into a bun. Then, to better emphasize both the human face and the pompadour, we apply a strong contrast in coloring. The face portion would obviously be more bright, however towards the edges and on the top, sides and back of their head, the plumage would be of a darker brown. The rest of the body is, yet again, clad in a different hue, a more traditional owl complexion. Since the bird portion of sirens is often brown, I'd opt for that, but it has to be distinct from the tone of the hair. This would be the final look. Yes, without context, this would just be an owl with a weird beak. However, we already have a unique feature, the shellfish diet. As I've described, this is in accordance with their habitat. Also, being diurnal is not an impossibility for owls, so we can have them singing along during daytime, although this does bring us to their song. This could appear as a tough nut to crack, but it really isn't. These animals are known to produce the hoot sound, but there are quite a few species who do not follow this tradition. The eastern screech owl, for example, has a very nice call. Much better than a nightingale, so overrated. We could have our sirens sing practically any song we'd like, something alluring and beautiful. Now, I cannot sing or produce any kind of music beyond below average whistling, so I leave this to your imaginations. We're all better off this way. Naturally, it is rather unlikely that it would actually lure sailors astray, unless there is something to gain by finding these birds. However, if it is a pleasant enough tune, their killing nature might be a logical embellishment. But meadows covered in rotting remains of unfortunate men is not something that would ever occur, unless a shipwreck happens or there's a naval battle nearby. The sirens would then leave the carcasses to rot, regardless of what Pliny says. As the last touch, some of you might be wondering the possible relation of the sirens to other owls. Early on, I only said they belonged to the Strigiformes, but nothing beyond that. Well, looking at the final results, it would likely be at least a relative of the Bubo genus, which not only contains animals of comparative size and overlapping habitats. Some owls of this classification prey on fish. While this species is likely to be different enough to form its own genus, it wouldn't be too far off. I think I've addressed all major points, so this is the end result. I know it's not a super unique design like the previous two, but it wasn't an easy one. If you have any better ideas or simply wish to discuss monsters, world building, or anything really, I'd like to invite you to my Discord channel. There's a link in the description to join. Next up is another suggestion made a while ago, which will probably also be among the longer ones. Hope to see you then. Bye!